Armed with the excessive clutter violation notice and a healthy dose of indignation, I marched to the HOA office, ready to give Karen McDictator a piece of my mind. I strode into the office, the laminated tile floor echoing my purposeful steps. Karen, perched behind her desk like a queen on her throne, looked up with a glacial smile. "Mr. Jones," she greeted, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "This," I said, slapping the violation notice on her desk. "This ridiculous accusation of excessive clutter." Karen's smile widened, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Ah, yes," she purred. "The clutter. It's quite unsightly." "Unsightly?" I retorted, my voice rising. "My yard is perfectly tidy. There's a garden gnome and some firewood, for heaven's sake. What exactly is the problem?" Karen leaned back in her chair, her expression smug. "The problem, Mr. Jones, is that your decorations do not conform to the community's aesthetic standards. We strive for a clean, uniform look throughout the neighborhood. Your clutter disrupts that vision." "Uniform?" I scoffed. "You mean boring. You want to turn our neighborhood into a Stepford suburb, where every house looks exactly the same, every lawn is perfectly manicured, and every resident is a mindless drone conforming to your arbitrary rules." Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice dangerously low, "I suggest you reconsider your tone. I am simply enforcing the rules. And the rules state that excessive clutter is prohibited." "Those rules are ridiculous," I exclaimed. "And you know it? You're just using them to exert your power over everyone." Karen stood up, her imposing figure looming over me. "Mr. Jones," she said, her voice laced with steel, "you are in violation of the HOA regulations. You have been issued a fine. You have two options: comply or face the consequences." I stared at her, my anger battling with a growing sense of despair. Reasoning with Karen was clearly futile. She was not interested in compromise, in fairness, or in common sense. She was interested in control, and she would use any means necessary to achieve it. I left the HOA office defeated but not broken. Karen might have won this round, but the war was far from over. I would not let her bully me into submission. I would find a way to fight back, to expose her tyranny, and to reclaim my right to a garden gnome and a pile of firewood. The fines started subtly, almost like a dripping faucet. A constant, irritating reminder of Karen's petty power. $50 a day. It didn't seem like much at first, a mere annoyance. But then the days turned into weeks, and the $50 multiplied, becoming a significant drain on my budget. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle of the thing. Being fined for a garden gnome and a stack of firewood felt like being nickel and dimed into submission. Each morning, I'd walk out to retrieve the newspaper, a quaint ritual I refused to give up despite the digital age, and there it would be, another bright orange violation notice, mocking me with its cheerful hue and its grim message. The fines weren't just financial, they were psychological, a constant reminder of Karen's control, a daily dose of frustration. I started to feel like I was living in a Kafkaesque nightmare, where arbitrary rules were enforced with an iron fist and logic had no place. Then came the letters. Official-looking envelopes, thick and heavy, arrived in the mail, addressed to resident, because, of course, Karen couldn't be bothered to use my actual name. Inside, legal jargon swirled like a dense fog, filled with phrases like breach of contract, injunctive relief, and punitive damages. I tried to decipher the legalese, my brow furrowed in concentration. Whereas the aforementioned clutter, and furthermore the aforementioned gnome, and in addition to the aforementioned firewood, it was like trying to read a foreign language while being yelled at. I even attempted to consult a dictionary of legal terms, a thick tome that weighed about as much as a brick. I flipped through the pages, searching for definitions, my eyes glazing over. Injunctive relief, an order requiring a person to do or refrain from doing a particular act. So in other words, Karen wanted a court order forcing me to remove the gnome and firewood. Punitive damages, damages awarded in addition to actual damages, in order to punish the defendant. So Karen wanted to punish me for having a garden gnome? It was also absurd. At one point, I found myself reading the letter aloud to Buster, my golden retriever, who was sprawled on the rug, blissfully unaware of the legal battles raging around him. "Buster," I said, "apparently my gnome is a threat to the community. It's causing irreparable harm to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." Buster yawned, stretched, and then proceeded to lick his paw with great concentration. He clearly had a better grasp of the situation than I did. Despite the intimidation factor of the legal threats, a spark of defiance flickered within me. Karen thought she could scare me into submission with her fancy legal jargon and her hefty fines. But she was wrong. The more she tried to bully me, the more determined I became to fight back. This wasn't just about a garden gnome and some firewood anymore. It was about standing up to a tyrant, about reclaiming my right to a little bit of individuality in a world that seemed to be increasingly obsessed with conformity. And I had a feeling that Buster, despite his apparent indifference, was on my side. The theft was a violation, a chilling intrusion that went beyond mere pettiness. It happened in the dead of night, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of a passing car. I was asleep, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding in my front yard. My security cameras, however, were wide awake. The footage was disturbing. A shadowy figure, clad in dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, crept onto my property. He moved with a furtive air, like a common thief, his eyes darting around as if he expected to be caught. He made a beeline for the gnome, that cheerful little fellow, who had become the symbol of my rebellion. He snatched it up, as if it were some priceless treasure, and stuffed it into a large burlap sack. Then he turned his attention to the firewood. He struggled to lift the neatly stacked pile, grunting with the effort. He managed to hoist a few logs into the sack, leaving the rest scattered haphazardly across my porch. It was a clumsy, almost comical display, like a burglar trying to steal Christmas trees. But the violation was no laughing matter. This wasn't just about a gnome and some firewood. It was about my privacy, my property, my sense of security. It was about Karen and the HOA crossing a line, moving from unreasonable to outright illegal. I rewound the footage, watching the shadowy figure's movements with a growing sense of anger. I paused the video, zooming in on the figure's face, trying to discern any identifying features. The baseball cap obscured most of his face, but I could make out a glimpse of a distinctive tattoo on his neck. A coiled snake. I knew that tattoo. It belonged to Big Tony, a local landscaper known for his flexible ethics and his willingness to do whatever job paid the most. Karen had hired a goon. But the most infuriating part of the footage came later. After the theft, the cameras captured a scene that made my blood boil. Karen, along with several other members of the HOA board, arrived at the edge of my property. They watched the footage of the theft on a phone, their faces lit up with smug satisfaction. They were celebrating their victory over me, laughing and making disparaging remarks about my tacky decorations and my rebellious attitude. "Finally," Karen cackled, "we've got her in line. She'll learn not to mess with us." "That'll teach her to question our authority," another board member chimed in. "And if she tries anything else," Karen added, her voice laced with malice, "we'll hit her with another fine, maybe even 2. The callousness of their words, the sheer delight they took in their petty act of theft, fueled my anger. It wasn't just about the stolen items. It was about the blatant abuse of power, the smug sense of entitlement, the sheer meanness of it all. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were enjoying the act of bullying. And that, I realized, was something I could not and would not tolerate. The game had changed. It was no longer about fighting back. It was about exposing them for what they were. Petty tyrants who reveled in their power over others. And I had the perfect plan to do it. The theft was the catalyst. the spark that ignited my plan. Karen and the HOA had crossed a line, and now they were going to pay. Not with angry letters or petty complaints, but with a full-blown, glorious, junk-filled rebellion. If they wanted clutter, I would give them clutter, mountains of it. Enough clutter to make their heads spin and their rule-book implode. My strategy was simple: turn their own weapon against them. They had declared war on clutter, so I would wage war with clutter. Every discarded item, every broken appliance, every piece of junk I could find would become a symbol of their overbearing control, a testament to their petty tyranny. The more they tried to enforce their ridiculous rules, the more junk I would accumulate, until my yard became a monument to their absurdity. The gathering of the junk was a community effort, a collective catharsis for all those who had suffered under Karen's reign. I started with my own garage, a repository of forgotten treasures and long-abandoned projects. There was the old armchair with the ripped upholstery, the rusty lawnmower that hadn't run in years, the box of broken Christmas lights that I swore I would fix someday. Each item I pulled out felt like a small act of defiance, a symbolic middle finger to Karen and her aesthetic standards. Then I took my campaign to the streets. I posted on local Facebook groups, Craigslist, and even Nextdoor, advertising a free junk giveaway. The response was overwhelming. People were eager to unload their unwanted items, and even more eager to contribute to my cause. They shared their own Karen stories, tales of petty fines, unreasonable demands, and general HOA madness. It was like a support group for victims of suburban tyranny. My neighbors, initially hesitant to get involved, were now enthusiastically joining the rebellion. Old Mrs. Higgins, whose prize-winning roses had been deemed too vibrant by Karen, donated a collection of rusty garden tools and a broken bird bath. Young Timmy, whose basketball hoop had been deemed too noisy, contributed a pile of old sports equipment and a deflated bouncy castle. Even Mr. Johnson, the perpetually grumpy man who always complained about everything, offered up a collection of broken appliances and a stack of old tires. The junk started piling up in my front yard, a glorious monument to consumerism and rebellion. There were old couches with missing cushions, broken refrigerators covered in magnets, stacks of dusty books, boxes of old clothes, and even a collection of ceramic gnomes that looked suspiciously like they were plotting world domination. Each item had a story, a history, a connection to someone who had been affected by Karen's petty rules, and each item was a weapon in my arsenal. The complaints box, now overflowing with orange violation notices and legal threats, sat proudly at the center of the junk pile, a symbol of Karen's bureaucratic tyranny. It was almost full, a testament to her dedication to nitpicking every detail of our lives. But it wouldn't be for long. Soon it would be joined by a mountain of junk so vast, so glorious, so utterly ridiculous that even Karen McDictator wouldn't be able to ignore it. The junkpocalypse was coming. The complaints box started as a simple cardboard container rescued from the recycling bin. It was initially intended to hold just the excessive clutter notice, a symbol of Karen's initial foray into petty tyranny. But as the orange notices multiplied, so did the box's significance. It became a repository for all of Karen's bureaucratic nonsense, a physical manifestation of her overbearing control. Each useless HOA letter, each ridiculous fine notice, each passive-aggressive memo found its way into the box, transforming it from a mere container into a symbol of Karen's power trip. Filling the box became a cathartic ritual. Every time I received a new piece of Karen's paper terrorism, I'd march to the box, the offending document clutched in my hand, and ceremoniously drop it inside. The satisfying thump of the paper hitting the bottom of the box was a small victory, a tiny act of defiance against her petty rules. As the box filled, it grew heavier, both physically and symbolically. It represented not just Karen's tyranny, but also the weight of her constant harassment, the frustration, the anger, the sheer absurdity of it all. And as it grew heavier, so did my resolve to fight back. The massive sign was the final touch, the visual exclamation point to my junk-filled declaration of independence. It was a behemoth, a bright yellow banner that stretched across my entire front yard, proclaiming in bold black letters the HOA's annual junk giveaway, free to all. The sign wasn't just big, it was strategically placed, ensuring maximum visibility to anyone driving down the street, including, and especially, Karen McDictator. It was a beacon of rebellion, a public announcement that I was not going to be bullied, that I was turning Karen's nonsense into a spectacle, a community event, a party. The sign wasn't just a sign, it was a statement. It was a visual representation of my defiance, a bold declaration that I was taking back control of my property, my sanity, and my sense of humor. It was also, I hoped, a subtle jab at the HOA, implying that they were the ones who had created this junk problem with their ridiculous rules and their constant harassment. The irony, I knew, would not be lost on them. The online campaign was the next logical step. I needed to spread the word, to invite the community to participate in the HOA junk giveaway, to turn my personal rebellion into a neighborhood-wide event. I crafted posts for Facebook, Craigslist, and Nextdoor, carefully balancing humor and sarcasm, subtly mocking the HOA without being overtly aggressive. "Tired of that old couch taking up space in your garage?" I wrote. "Have a broken appliance you just can't seem to part with? Well, good news. The HOA is hosting its annual junk giveaway. They're calling it community beautification, but we all know what it really is. Come on down to my place this Saturday and claim your free treasure. One man's junk is another man's, well, you know. See you there." I added a picture of the massive sign, just to emphasize the point. And of course, I included a close-up of the complaints box, overflowing with orange notices, just to remind everyone who was really responsible for this mess. The posts went live, and I sat back, a sense of mischievous anticipation building in my chest. The junkpocalypse was about to begin. The morning of the HOA junk giveaway dawned bright and sunny, almost as if the universe itself was in on the joke. By 8 a.m., my front yard, already overflowing with junk, was transformed into a scene of organized chaos. Dozens of people had arrived, a motley crew of bargain hunters, treasure seekers, and nosy neighbors, all eager to claim their share of the free bounty. There were families with minivans ready to haul away furniture, college students looking for cheap decorations for their dorm rooms, and even a few antique collectors hoping to find a hidden gem amongst the rubble. They milled about the junk pile, digging through boxes, inspecting couches, and haggling over the price of a slightly rusty exercise bike. It was like a flea market, a yard sale, and a circus all rolled into one. The variety of items was astounding. There were old lamps, broken toys, stacks of vinyl records, boxes of mismatched dishes, and even a taxidermied squirrel wearing a tiny hat. It was a testament to the sheer volume of stuff we accumulate in our lives, and a perfect illustration of Karen's obsession with clutter. The air buzzed with excited chatter, the occasional shout of, "I call dibs on the rocking chair," and the general din of people rummaging through, well, junk. And then Karen arrived. She pulled up in her pristine white SUV, her face a mask of thunderous fury. She surveyed the scene, her eyes widening in disbelief. Her perfectly sculpted power bob seemed to quiver with indignation. She looked like a pressure cooker about to explode. She parked her car haphazardly, nearly hitting Mrs. Higgins' prize-winning roses, the irony was almost too much to bear, and stormed towards the crowd. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice barely audible above the din. "This is outrageous! This is clutter!" The crowd, engrossed in their treasure hunt, barely acknowledged her. A few people glanced up, offered a polite smile, and then went back to their rummaging. Karen's authority, her carefully constructed image of control, was completely undermined. She was just another voice in the crowd, a frantic, red-faced woman yelling about, well, clutter. She tried to push her way through the throng, attempting to assert her authority. "This is private property," she yelled. "You're all trespassing. Leave immediately." But no one listened. They were too busy digging through the junk, finding unexpected treasures, and enjoying the spectacle of Karen's meltdown. She was like a tiny, angry chihuahua barking at a pack of wolves. Her power, her influence, her carefully crafted image of control had all vanished, replaced by a wave of junk-fueled chaos. The junkpocalypse had begun, and Karen McDictator was powerless to stop it. The HOA HQ toilet was a stroke of comedic genius, a perfect symbol of the community's collective disdain for Karen and her iron-fisted HOA rule. It arrived on the back of a pickup truck, driven by none other than Mr. Johnson, the perpetually grumpy neighbor who had contributed his fair share of broken appliances to the junk pile. He hopped out of the truck, a mischievous glint in his eye, and unloaded the toilet, a slightly used but otherwise functional porcelain throne. He carefully positioned it in front of the HOA office, right next to the meticulously manicured flower bed, which, ironically, had been deemed too colorful by Karen. Then he produced a roll of duct tape and a large piece of cardboard. With a flourish, he wrote HOA HQ in bold letters and taped the sign to the back of the toilet. The crowd erupted in laughter, appreciating the sheer audacity of the gesture. The HOA HQ toilet became an instant sensation, a symbol of rebellion, a public declaration that the community had had enough of Karen's, well, you know. The toilet wasn't just a toilet, it was a statement. It symbolized the HOA's perceived disregard for the community's needs, their focus on petty rules over actual issues. It was a humorous, yet pointed way of saying, "We think your policies are crap." And the fact that it was placed directly in front of their office for all the world to see made it even more delicious. As the morning progressed, the chaos escalated. The junk pile grew larger, attracting more attention from passers-by. Cars slowed down, people stopped to gawk, and the HOA junk giveaway became a local phenomenon. The news even showed up, cameras rolling, eager to capture the spectacle. They interviewed me, asking about the giveaway and the inspiration behind it. I, of course, played it coy, emphasizing the community spirit and the desire to recycle unwanted items. I carefully avoided mentioning Karen by name, but the implication was clear. The junk wasn't just junk anymore, it was performance art, a living, breathing testament to the absurdity of the HOA's rules. It was a spectacle that was impossible to ignore, a visual representation of the community's frustration, and a giant middle finger to Karen McDictator. The junkpocalypse was in full swing, and it was glorious. The arrival of the police was almost anticlimactic. Two officers, looking slightly bewildered by the scene of utter chaos unfolding before them, cautiously approached me. "Sir," the younger officer began, "we received a complaint about, excessive clutter and a possible disturbance." He gestured towards the sprawling junk pile with a bemused expression. "Is this a yard sale?" I couldn't help but chuckle. "Not exactly, officer. It's more of a community donation drive. The HOA is generously giving away unwanted items to anyone who wants them." I gestured towards the HOA HQ toilet with a flourish. "They even have a designated headquarters now." The officers exchanged glances, clearly trying to process the situation. The older officer, a seasoned veteran with a world-weary air, sighed. "Ma'am, I understand that this might be unconventional. But as long as the items are being given away freely and there's no public safety hazard, there's nothing we can do." "But the clutter!" Karen shrieked, emerging from the crowd, her face contorted with fury. "It's a violation! It's an eyesore! It's... Words failed her, and she sputtered into silence. The older officer turned to Karen, his expression a mixture of pity and amusement. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but unless you can prove that these items are being sold illegally or that they pose a danger to the public, there's no legal basis for us to intervene." Karen, defeated and deflated, could only watch as the officers retreated, shaking their heads and muttering about the weirdness of suburban life. The HOA's power once absolute and unquestioned, had been rendered utterly useless by a pile of junk and a community's collective sense of humor. But I wasn't done yet. The police intervention was just the warm-up act. The main event was about to begin. I marched back into the HOA office, Karen trailing behind me like a disgruntled shadow. I slammed the excessive clutter violation notice and all the subsequent fines onto Karen's desk. "You've been served," I declared, my voice ringing with righteous anger. "I'm filing a counter-complaint against you and the HOA for illegal property removal, trespassing, and harassment." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" she sputtered. "You can't do that. We're the HOA. We make the rules." "Not anymore," I retorted. "You've abused your power, you've violated my property rights, and you've terrorized this community with your petty tyranny. It's time for you to face the consequences." I turned and walked out of the office, leaving Karen speechless and surrounded by a mountain of junk. The junkpocalypse had reached its climax, and the HOA, once the symbol of suburban control, was now the laughingstock of the neighborhood. The tables had turned, and I, the once victimized homeowner, was now the one holding all the cards. The HOA junk giveaway wasn't just a neighborhood event, it was a media sensation. Local news outlets, always hungry for a good story, descended upon my front yard like vultures on a carcass. Cameras rolled, reporters interviewed attendees, and the junkpocalypse became the lead story on the evening news. The narrative was irresistible. A David versus Goliath battle, with Jones, the underdog homeowner, standing up to a tyrannical HOA represented by the formidable Karen McDictator. The news coverage painted a vivid picture of the chaos, the overflowing junk pile, the HOA HQ toilet, and of course Karen's increasingly frantic attempts to control the situation. The reporters highlighted the absurdity of the excessive clutter violation, showcasing the garden gnome and the neatly stacked firewood as examples of Karen's petty rule enforcement. They even interviewed some of my neighbors, who were more than happy to share their own Karen stories, further cementing her image as the neighborhood villain. The HOA, naturally, was mortified. Their carefully crafted image of suburban authority was shattered, replaced by a picture of bureaucratic overreach and petty tyranny. The public ridicule was relentless. Online forums buzzed with comments, memes featuring Karen and the HOA HQ toilet went viral, and the HOA's phone lines were flooded with complaints. They had become a laughingstock, the butt of every suburban joke. The HOA board, holed up in their pristine office, the irony wasn't lost on anyone, held an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with panic. Mr. Henderson, usually so composed, paced nervously, his face pale. Mrs. Peterson, her no-nonsense demeanor cracking under the pressure, wrung her hands. Mr. Johnson, surprisingly, was the only one who seemed to find the humor in the situation, though he wisely kept his amusement to himself. "This is a disaster!" Mr. Henderson exclaimed, his voice trembling. "Our reputation is ruined. We're the laughingstock of the entire town." "What are we going to do?" Mrs. Peterson wailed. "We have to do something." We have to apologize," Mr. Johnson suggested tentatively. A collective groan filled the room. Apologize? To Jones? To the woman they had tried to bully into submission? The thought was almost unbearable. But they had no choice. The public outcry was too loud. The media attention too intense. They were forced to acknowledge their overreach, to admit that they had made a mistake. The clutter rule, the symbol of their petty tyranny, was quietly removed from the HOA regulations. It was a tacit admission of defeat. And then, Karen resigned. The pressure was too much, the humiliation too profound. She couldn't face the community, the media, or even herself. Her reign of terror was finally over. The HOA junk giveaway, initially intended as a small act of rebellion, had become a catalyst for change, a symbol of the community's power to stand up to tyranny. And I, the once bullied homeowner, had become the unlikely hero, the one who dared to challenge the queen of suburban control and won.